Well, today is going to be a bit different. I decided to do a piece on science today. There's been quite a bit of backlash based on what Donald Trump's administration, the executive order that was launched like a week ago to restore gold standard science in America. And yeah, I think it's being taken quite a bit politically. And as a scientist, I feel it's also my obligation to give my opinion and to maybe put a different perspective on the entire situation and the context. Um, so I'm still largely involved in science. I mean, at the moment, I don't have a position, but I still have quite a lot of work to publish, and so I'm quite still in the midst of the scientific field. So I think I can talk to it and give my perspective, even if I'm not all too familiar with the American system. I only worked there maybe around 2 years for a postdoc I did, but I understand the science system in general fairly well. So I think I'm allowed to speak to it and give my opinion. Well, I mean, it's definitely I definitely think that the science field needs to be revised or needs to be changed because as it is, and I'll explain the system a bit more in detail later on. But I think there's definitely a need for change. Now, the current U.S. administration obviously takes matters in their own hands, and it's quite disruptive. And that's obviously it's always going to be bad, right? People losing their funding. You have projects where you work for years on a project and you get funding and you're in the midst of it and then suddenly funding is pulled. That's awful. It's an awful situation. Also, the planned or I think probably potentially already implemented cuts on overheads. I mean, that's really difficult for smaller labs or emerging scientists. And what overheads are, it's quite a critical part of funding. So let's assume you want to do a project, you do whatever. Like me, you work in immunology, you have a project, you want to analyze some kind of stuff as related to the immune system, and of course you need to pay staff, so you have salaries on the funding proposals, you have consumables, so actually do work in the lab, right? Consumables, all the reagents. And then, well, if you pay salaries and you're, for instance, located at a university or like myself in the past, an independent research organization, well, you need to keep the lights on. You need to have a lab. You actually need to have an infrastructure. And this is what overheads are supposed to cover. So I think in the US, I think traditionally it was 35%. I think the plan was to reduce it to 15% or something like that. And now just to give a little bit more context to those numbers, right? So that means that if you hire a person, you pay them a full salary, they're working full time, and then 35%, for instance, taking that number, 35% of that salary needs to be given additionally to the institution so that actually you have one person sitting at a desk, so all of that is infrastructure. You have a lab, so the more people you have, the bigger the infrastructure you need to actually carry out the research, and that's what overheads are supposed to cover, partially or completely. Now, just to put those 35% in a particular light, well, I work in a fully independent research organization. It wasn't an academic institution, it was a charity, and we had 115% overheads. So for every person I hire, I almost have to have double the salary because more than the salary, 115% of that salary, goes towards the institution to keep the lights on. So for instance, if the institution is renting a building, we need to pay rent, right? So it's not that you have a beautiful idea and you do the math and I need those reagents and I need that amount of capacity, those kind of samples, potentially clinical samples. I need a postdoc, I need a staff, I need a technician. Well, that's fine, but then you also have to double the salary, more than double the salaries, because a lot of that money is going to be swallowed by the institution. Now, I'm fairly critical about that blanket. Well, let's reduce everything from 35% to whatever 15. Don't quote me on the numbers. I believe that I heard that, but it could be more or less that number. I do not believe that a blanket reduction, or I don't actually believe that overheads. I believe that overheads should be institution dependent. So saying that any university in the US, however big or small it is, whether it's private or public, requires the same financial support to keep labs afloat, which overheads are for, I mean, that's a fallacy. That is in no way, shape, or form is that the truth. Smaller universities would potentially require much larger overheads just to keep science alive on their sites. Because keeping labs, I mean, it depends what kind of research you do, but you might need biosafety level 2, 3, or even more, and then suddenly costs balloon out of proportion. You need core facilities. If you want to do some sequencing or any of these things, that changes everything. So first of all, I think even initially, I think the 35% doesn't make any sense. You should be able to ask for way more overheads if you're in a small university that actually requires more funding to keep science alive. And potentially, if you're in a very wealthy private university, maybe you should even receive less than 15%. So I think that blanket reduction, that blanket overhead number and then that blanket reduction, I think doesn't make any sense. And I think that's definitely a mistake. So let's maybe just address, what the standards are that were in that executive order from the U.S. president. So there are things that are undoubtedly, that are completely logical, right? So the gold standard of science should be that the science is reproducible. That makes complete sense. Should be transparent. You should be able to say whatever you want to. You should be able to show everything that you've done in a transparent fashion. Nothing should be hidden, and it's part of the gold standard of publication, right? You have a method section, and everyone, based on the information that you provide, should be able to reproduce the experiments. Doesn't mean that they're going to find the same result, but they should be able to do exactly what you've done. Everything that you've done should be completely transparent. Everything needs to be mentioned. Then the third point in that executive order was that it's supposed to be communicative of error and uncertainty. That again is it shouldn't have to be said. Part of a publication, you have, obviously, when you publish something, you have an introduction. You say, well, this is the context of my research, and this is why I've done it. And then either there's a method section before, after the results section, and you say what you observed in a very descriptive manner. You don't discuss your results in the results section. But then there's the discussion section, and this is where you put your result into the context of the current state of the art or your current literature. And this is where you basically discuss, well, did you have a significant result statistically, or was it maybe a trend? And this is where you bring about uncertainty and how you interpret your results and what you think it means. And this is why the discussion is, you could basically agree to disagree on the discussion, because it's how you interpret basically the results. The results should be matter-of-factly. It should be just stated. You don't put a value on it. You just say, okay, this is what I observed. And this is how I statistically analyzed it, and whether there was a significant difference or not. So these first 3 points as a gold standard of research, I mean, that's already what everyone should be doing. If they're not doing it, then they're not really carrying out proper research. The fourth one should be collaborative and interdisciplinary. Not necessarily. I'm not sure why this is the gold standard. You don't necessarily have to collaborate. I mean, sometimes you have major findings that are described by one lab. Of course, collaboration is always good if needed for a particular project, but you don't have to be collaborative necessarily for gold standard research. Also, across disciplines, not necessarily either. You can be in your own little field and you find something extraordinary, and in your own lab or whatever, you had a graduate student that found something by him or herself, and there's nothing else to it. You don't necessarily have to collaborate. Of course, nowadays the technologies are so advanced and everything is so advanced that typically you have to collaborate, even if it's just internally or with core facilities. Like you need a lot of people with different expertises to collaborate on big things, but I'm not sure. I would have probably not mentioned that. It's not a core for me. It's not a core characteristic of gold standard research. The next one is again fairly simple and straightforward. You should be skeptical of your findings and assumptions. I mean, that's part of science. Again, if you're not always kind of double checking your results or skeptical of your own hypotheses, I mean, then you're not really doing your job as a scientist. That should be inherent to any kind of science. So these were the first 5 points. The next 4 are really where there could be a lot of discussion around it. The next point is that the research should be structured for falsifiability of hypotheses. So you basically have a hypothesis, and you need to make sure that you try to break the hypothesis or prove that it's wrong, right? Because you could be entirely biased, and that makes complete sense, right? You have a hypothesis, and just because I would really love for this cell to do X, Y, and Z, that would be awesome, wouldn't it? But you can't invent biology, right? Biology is biology. Like, so if that cell type is not doing the function you ascribe it to, it's just bad luck. So you should obviously conduct experiments to prove the opposite, right? So that you actually have, if your cell type does what you think it does, then you have more evidence that it actually does it. Where I have issues with that is, it would be hard to put a number on it, but not all research is hypothesis driven. There's an entire side of research these days, and even journals had to create special sections for it, where what you do is entirely descriptive. So, because sequencing, like whether it's transcriptomic sequencing or DNA sequencing, has become so, cheap. Of course, if you do a lot, it's going to be very expensive very quickly, but sequencing has, over the last decades, become so cheap that if your lab is aligned with that particular research, and you have, for instance, like clinical samples that are extremely valuable, you collaborate with clinicians, or you are yourself a clinician, you can just sequence things for the first time, and so you're going to be able to publish that extremely well. You have a particular organ that hasn't been really looked at, you do single cell sequencing on that organ, potentially even spatial transcriptomics, and because it's the first time it has ever been done, it's extremely valuable. Now, there's no hypothesis involved at all. So I just hope that all those points they not all have to be ticked to be gold standard research in the eyes of the new administration, because you can do things just for the sake of doing them without, there's no hypothesis. It's just like, oh yeah, we've never looked at that particular organ and how it's, what kind of cell composition is in there, or how the cells change according to a specific therapy or something like that. So a lot of research these days is very observational. And now we have these sections in journals that are called resources. So you basically say, this is a resource. I've done all this work. I'm not placing it in any type of context. I just give it to the scientific community as a resource. So if you have a hypothesis, maybe my data set allows you to address it or something like that. So falsibility of hypothesis, that's not necessarily, doesn't have to be necessarily be part of gold standard research. It can, but it doesn't have to be. Now the next point, the seventh point, it should be subject to unbiased peer review. Now that's a dream. That's never going to happen. And I'll go into the structure of the science system, how peer review works a bit later on. But peer review is always going to be biased, and peer review itself, I'll have to explain it. It's not what people actually think. I mean, it is to some extent, but also there's things that I'll have to explain. So this one, it's a pipe dream. It's never going to happen. The next one, you should be able to accept negative results as a positive outcome, meaning that, you do a clinical study. I mean, it's an important point, but you're always going to have to publish it lower impact. Like, there's no way you should publish it for sure, and I know people that would not publish these kind of things, but and that's probably my point, right? Taking it as a positive outcome, where you're asking people to change their viewpoint, which is not going to happen. If someone hates negative results, they're going to hate it regardless. What you potentially could enforce is the publication thereof, because some people would hold it back, and that's the issue. For instance, if you run a clinical study, you have to register it before you start before the first patient is enrolled. Because if it's out there, if you say, well, you have ethics approval, and then you enroll it at an international clinical trial registry, that forces you, the study is out there, so if 5 years after completion you still haven't published your study, people would know about it. And like, where's the data? Was it just negative and you don't want to publish it? So you can't force to have people thinking, oh yeah, it's great, we have a negative result. I mean, you can't change the character of scientists. Some people will say, oh, I actually learned something by doing it, so they're going to have that perspective anyway. But it's the publication part which is really, really important. And I agree that it is an important point. It depends how you want to implement that. If you have a drug and you want to, again, we're probably talking about randomized controlled trials, where you compare it to placebo and there's no difference. That's a very important finding. You're basically showing, well, this stuff doesn't work. So it has to be published. Of course, it's going to suck if you have intellectual property on something and you really think it's going to be a blockbuster drug with no side effects, and you've got nothing. Well, of course, it's great to know that it doesn't work, but it's still a bit it's going to be a sad moment. But it's important to be published. So, however you think it is, even if you are disappointed, you should still publish it. So, with that point, I think it really depends on what they mean and how they want to implement it. And the last point, I mean, that's a very difficult one. Gold standard research should be conducted in the absence of conflicts of interest. That again is, I think, a dream. I know what they're trying to achieve, but what's really important is that conflicts of interest are completely transparent. And I don't think they're fully transparent yet. In any kind of journal publication, you need to state your conflict of interest. So for instance, you are involved in a clinical trial and you hold a patent for the drug. And you publish beautiful results, you clearly need to state, well, look, I have a massive conflict of interest here. I am the patent holder, or I own the company that sponsored this trial. This needs to be transparent. I would argue that in most cases it is, but sometimes it's not entirely clear, or some things are not being mentioned, and that becomes really important when you want to publish this. And the editors need to be potentially a bit more critical about conflicts of interest. But that's a difficult one. It's hard to have, I mostly have no conflicts of interest because like my type of science, there was never really an issue with trying to make money out of it. I held one patent at some stage, and we tried to develop something. And of course I said, well, you look, we have this patent, we don't have a company, there's no earnings yet, and this is really early days, so we're just trying to do some experiments with it. So, but then it's transparent. But you cannot block something just because there's a conflict of interest, because where do you put the bar? I just, small scientist, I put a patent on something that I think is going to really help people. I need to somehow develop it. I don't earn money on it. I'm just really excited that I found something that might potentially help people. So the absence of conflicts of interest is that's a dream. That actually would put barriers in science. But I understand where they're coming from. But they need to be a bit more precise about what they're planning on doing here. So when I read this executive order, it was obviously framed in the context of everything that happened with COVID. I think there were quite a few things mentioned: global warming, DI, various things that the current U.S. administration disagrees with, and so they just want to put their stamp onto research. And so the reason I wanted to bring all of this up, because there's all these critical pieces now that come out, either in high impact journals or in newspapers, The Guardian, Nature, the journal. Where people basically are very much afraid of a kind of like government or state-directed research. That the government tells you what you can research on, and there's things you can't do, and that's obviously a fear to have. This would be terrible if that would ever happen. That there are things that you cannot touch. You should be able to touch everything. And I think if you want to put a positive light on that executive order, it's like assuming that everything can be touched. It should be touched in a as unbiased way as possible, with as little conflicts of interest as possible, and publishing and making negative results available, and potentially putting more emphasis on it. And maybe the scientific journals need to also be given a role here, because they obviously they don't like it. It's not very, very, very good for them to put negative results, because it doesn't have the impact that they wish. Now let me just, sorry, I'm just going through my stream of thoughts here. let me just present the science system to you a bit, because I think it's an important piece in this. And I don't think the general population understands how science works, because it is a system. If you think that, well, science careers are based on talent, on research excellence, it partly is, but a large part of that will be based on chance and politics, science, internal politics. So what you need to know is there's three major players in the science system. There's obviously the scientists, there's the funding agencies, the funding bodies, so largely governmental. There would always be a large governmental aspect to funding, but not only, right? You have other funding sources. I mean, you have philanthropy. That's pretty good. You have different societies. You have there's different ways to get funding these days. You know. So you have the scientists, the funding bodies, and then what's I think sometimes underestimated is the power of the journals. The journals hold a tremendous power, and perhaps for historical reasons. And my question would be whether this system is a bit outdated. The reason why I say this is, well, let's just take newspapers, for example, right? Typical newspapers. Like, how many people these days actually buy physical newspapers, right? Unless you're sitting at a coffee shop or something like that, you're probably not touching physical newspapers. Your main information system or source of information is online. Nothing is printed anymore. And so with newspapers, you can have the same structure. You know, you have journalists, the content doesn't change. It's just that instead of mostly being printed, it's mostly being consumed online, but it's the same content. So originally, the reason to be for a scientific journal would be old school, to actually print it out. They were printing businesses. Of course, there were editors and there are editorials and things like that. So there's a little bit of journal-specific or journal-intrinsic content, but most of it has always been the papers that the scientists submit to these journals. Now, the situation currently is the large majority, I can't even put a number on it, but I've hardly seen any printed journals in decades, probably. When I did my PhD, maybe we had that. And I do print out the PDF, so sometimes if I access the electronic version and then I print it out so that I can make notes on paper, because I kind of like that. But it's mostly consumed online. Online access to those journals. So the physical printing aspect of that job is gone since a long, long time. I think you can still, for some journalists, you can still, if you are subscribed to it, you're still getting shipped sometimes a physical copy. But by far, like 95 plus probably % of all scientific papers are accessed online. That's what I would say based on my experience. So now, putting a contrast between a newspaper and a scientific journal, the newspaper, as I mentioned, you still have the same staff, you still have the same journalists, you still have the same content. It's just virtual instead of physical. With journals, like, you still have that tiny piece of editorials and comments and things like that, but they're basically only putting your work online with a particular format, and obviously there's stamp on it, which is the most important part, right? Where have you published? But it's basically, if I want to look at it very critically, it's like a glorified online publishing system. And you could do that on any kind of online platform. You could just publish it, and you pay thousands of dollars to do so. So you're paying for that service. So at some stage you could think, well, what's the reason to still have that middleman? It's like a middleman. And that's going to sound obviously very, very critical. There is, of course, there's value, right, to the things that are beyond the scientific papers, which is the bulk of the journals, right? But then you have editorials, you have reviews and comments, but again, sometimes they invite scientists to do all that work. So then comes the question of, what what is the structure of these journals? And there's an editorial board or various editors-in-chief sometimes, and then associate editors, and where do they come from? And again, if I want to push, it's all about perspective, right? I'm putting devil's advocate on things just to put some light on these things. If you want to play devil's advocate, the editors are a bit like unelected officials in other realms, like the things that are being criticized. Well, who has elected these people that have tremendous power? And now I'm coming to the power aspect of these things. So these editors. So I don't want to put a blanket statement on these things, right? Because every journal will be widely different. Sometimes the editors, it's a full-time job. They're just editing. They're just editors. Sometimes they're actually full-on academics that also happen to be sometimes editor-in-chief of a journal. So these people are going to be extremely busy. So they're still busy academically or on a purely applied research side. And then on top of that, they're managing a journal. So that's enormous. That's an enormous workload. That's my respect, and I applaud these people that do that. But you have just professional editors. The career of an editor, there's no specific requirements. Sometimes they've never led a lab. They come straight out of their PhD or maybe 1 year postdoc. They're recruited as editors, and they can make it all the way through to editor-in-chief. So you're wondering, well, this is a tremendous power given to people that aren't elected by the academic field. And this is a good or bad thing. I'm just stating as it is, a bit on the critical side. And so the power that they hold is absolutely tremendous. First of all, they are going to determine if your work is worthy of their journal. And that's obviously going to be journal specific. You want to publish in the highest impact journals. It's about worthiness. We're like, do I like this thing or not? Now, of course, it's going to go into peer review. And the peer review, that's, of course, there is an editorial review, but this is not peer review yet. The editorial review is only there to determine if it goes to peer review. So if they quickly read your manuscript, and they probably haven't read it all, they just probably look at the abstract and a few things, then they decide whether it's worthy of peer review, not necessarily understanding it all. Because you imagine like an editor, and of course sometimes there's section editors and there are specialized editors and things like that, but the likelihood that they understand all of your work is, it's unlikely that they understand it all. So that's why it's actually being sent to international experts that are then providing peer review. But the initial decision whether it actually goes to experts, that's only the decision of the editor or the editorial board. So that holds tremendous power. And And because at the end of the day, your likelihood to get funding depends on where you published before. 100%. People don't have the time to read all your proposals. They're going to look at your CV, where did you publish before? If you published high impact, your likelihood to get funding is so much higher, right? So these editors, they have power over your career, no problem. Of course, if you want to have a real discussion, yeah, of course, there's work that shouldn't be published high impact, right? Because well, it wasn't actually very good. And so there's shades of gray there. I fully understand that, but you need to put this into context, right? These are middlemen. Like the journals are middlemen that are not required. They are not required. You could put everything online, let the scientific community judge of your work. There are other ways, and there are some journals that actually try differently, but the system reels them back in because it's a well-oiled system that makes a lot of money. These journals or these publishing companies make a lot of money. So the second aspect of that power is, and this is where bias is going to come in, as I perceive it. So what is the key role of an editor? It is, of course it is to some extent to make money, but it's not the main key thing, because where you have a particular number of articles you're going to publish per month or something like that, so you're going to make the money regardless. So the power is more, or the responsibility of the editor is more that they need to keep the impact factor high. If an editor is being hired by a publishing company and after 2 years the impact factor has dropped by half, that editor is going to go, 100%. Even if they do a great job, they're going to go. The impact factor is a number. Every journal has one, and that's how the system runs. It's all by impact factor. If you publish something, you're going to look at what kind of impact factor journals. The impact factor it's related to the journal, not necessarily to your work. Because the impact factor is you're looking at how many citations do the articles that are being published in that journal typically get on average. So it's an average. Every year you have a different impact factor, right? So it changes because citations change. Typically things are very stable, but sometimes things go up or down. And for me, the primary role of the editor will always be to keep the impact factor high. And if they've done a good job and the impact factor actually increases, they will promote that. They will put that on their LinkedIn profile. They would put that on everything, because it's, oh, look at me. I chose the articles that were cited more. So that's based on my expertise. I was right in my selection because everything went high. Now the impact factor, if you look at it very objectively, and again, I'm playing devil's advocate here because I think the field or the public needs a different perspective. You can't just continue to say, well, science is excellent and those politicians are meddling in our excellent system. If you think about it logically, even if you're talking about a different field, let's assume it's not science, but okay, we have a measure of quality, and that measure of quality is a number that's based on how many times people cite the particular work. If you think about it 100% logically, without any putting on emotions on it, to keep an impact factor high, you would preferentially select things that are likely to be cited by a lot of people, right? That's the pure maths of it, right? You're going to choose things that you think are going to be cited a shit ton, right? And so you have only a specific amount of articles you can publish per month. And again, I'm very critical. It's a very critical viewpoint. I'm not saying that that's how the editors always think, but But the logic says, well, if you have only a specific number of articles you can publish, which high impact journals have, they're restricted, you're going to take the thing that's more mainstream. Of course, like in high impact, it's never, like it's always very big advances, but it's advances in mainstream fields. Because that's the only way to guarantee that that thing is going to be cited a lot. If you take something that is completely off field, that is out there, someone has, even if it's the best thing in the world, and it's really like no one else is doing that stuff, that thing is not going to be cited at all, potentially. So intrinsically, the system is biased towards mainstream. It's pure math. There's nothing there to say anymore. It is based on mainstream. And of course, I'm not attacking editors personally here. And as I said, every journal is going to be different based on who the editor is or how big the editorial team is. But you need to realize that you have a middleman in the system that makes a shit ton of money, that has no intrinsic reason to be. It doesn't. Of course, I love to read sometimes pieces, like because it's like it puts things into context. Oh yeah, this month we're going to publish this, and it really fits with that hypothesis. They provide value, but not proportionally to the power that they hold and the money that they make. And the system itself, you always have a few people that try to change the system. Even sometimes journals that go out of their way, because let's now move into, it's still the system, it's still journals, but let's talk a little bit about peer review. And one of the gold standards should be unbiased peer review. Forget it. Never gonna happen. That's not, like, as a scientist, I can tell you that this is never gonna happen. I'm not sure who wrote these rules, but they're a bit detached from reality. Peer review. So I peer review for good journals. I've done it in the past, and so what is peer review? So let's assume you are an expert or you're doing your thing, and then an editor has decided that they selected something for peer review, and they sent you the peer review request. So peer review is always going to be in addition to all of your work. You're not paid for it. You're supposed to do whatever. If you don't have time, well, you better do it during the night or during the weekend. But of course, if a good journal asks you to do it, like, it's good to have that link, because if I do it for that journal, maybe next time if I submit something, the editor remembers me, and then maybe I'm more likely to publish in there, right? So it's all this kind of system that is well oiled. Everything works really well because there's pressures and there's like incentives. So you're getting that peer review request. If it's something that's really aligned with your work and like, it's a competitor, well, of course, you're likely to read that, because by the time it's getting published, that's probably a few months down the line, probably half a year. So you have an advantage because you access stuff that's not published yet, and it's being sent to you because you're also an expert in the field. Otherwise, it wouldn't be sent to you in the first place, right? And so you're likely to take it if it's a good journal and if it's aligned with your work, and even better if it's a competitor, you're gonna take it. Scientists are human. If you tell me that the review is going to be unbiased and that my potential competitor, where my work is being sent to, is going to look at it completely objectively, that makes no sense. It's human nature. Of course, it's going to be biased. Now the system has built in a few fail-safes for that, but again, it's not 100% bulletproof. You can, when you submit something, You can ask to have reviewers excluded to the editor, right? You say like, this is the work I'm submitting, dear editor. I'd like to exclude X, Y, and Z because they hate me, or I've talked to them at conferences, they completely disagree with my viewpoint, so there's no way they're going to give you an unbiased review. You can suggest as well, you can say, well, facilitates or supports the work of the editor. The editor, I mean, but the good thing about them is they're usually very well connected, so they would know, well, you get that paper, oh, I know where I'm going to send that one to. I'm going to have those people that I've already talked to at conferences, and they're probably going to be able to give me a good review. So you can suggest people, you can exclude people. But to this day, in the best journals, the best ones, you still it's still completely not transparent. So as of a few years ago, well, first of all, you have no idea who it's being sent to. You don't have the identity of the reviewers. Lower tier journals do, but the highest ones do not. Completely black box. So you don't know who is being sent to. You can ask for your names to be blacked out, so the reviewers would not know who has done this work. But listen, let's just focus on high impact, because this has the biggest potential, has the biggest leverage in terms of funding, and has the biggest importance in terms of societal change, right? We're talking about the big journals. So you can ask for your names to be blacked out, but at that level of science, if an expert in the field is going to read that, even without the names, I can tell you that, like, the number of people it could come from will be, you can count them on the fingers of one hand. They would know, based on how it's written, I know who that is. So it's always blacked out it's a one-way street. The reviewer will always know more than the person that's being reviewed. And they're very reluctant to change that. They don't want to do what other lower tier journals do, which is to make things transparent. At the end of a review, when something is published in a lower review journal, lower impact journal, the names of the reviewers are literally written on the paper, so you know who actually did that work. So to give something to the system, because they're like, oh yeah, we're being aggressively asked to change a bit things, it's not transparent, blah, blah, blah. So what they've done recently, since a few years, is to make the review process transparent. So to avoid that, the reviewer says, well, the author has clearly no idea what they're talking about, and I think this is horrible work, and yeah, should be rejected immediately. So the communication from the reviewers to the reviewee, the back and forth, because it can go several cycles, right? So you basically, as a reviewer, you say, well, I really like that paper, but I would do X, Y, and Z just to make sure that this is ruled out and this is ruled out, Going back to the golden rule of, well, you should falsify your hypothesis, right? So if you really had an hypothesis and you didn't really try to falsify it, well, your reviewer can come back and say, look, you haven't done your work here, you should do X, Y, and Z. And then it goes back, potentially it's half a year's work or a year's work, and then they go back and do that thing. And then you resubmit, and then it goes back to the reviewer makes sure that you actually addressed all of their comments, and then suddenly potentially another comment might come through. Or based on the new work that you submitted, I found another thing that you need to do, right? So it can go back and forth it can go a couple of years, to be honest, for something to be published on that level. And so all of that process, that communication is being made available in those high impact journals now, but only recently. But you still don't know who wrote it. They still don't want to divulge that identity, which, to be honest, if I criticize something, I want to be able to tell it to your face. If I go to a conference and I read your poster, I have no problem standing there and say, well, I mean, what's with that here? I don't quite understand it. Or why did you do that? That doesn't make any sense. It's a bit like social media, right? You're hiding. Why are you not willing to just put your name on? the journals don't do it because the reviewers don't want it. It's not that everyone says, yeah, I don't have a problem, I have my name on. No, of course not. At a very, very high level, it's so competitive. You have so many egomaniacs in science. They don't want their names to be put there. So don't tell me that the science system is perfect. It's all based on excellence. There's a lot of egomaniacs out there that are power hungry, and if they have the opportunity to smash their opponents or their competitors, they will, 100%. I've seen it myself. Science can, on the very high level, it's very competitive and can get very ugly very quickly. So that gives you a bit an idea of that, So you have the scientists that fight to get money, but the money goes via journals, and the journals have their own agenda, and then they're fighting against their competitors. And also just the last thing about the peer review, because I've seen it on several podcasts, especially when the entire discussion of COVID and who has double-checked the data? Who has double-checked X, Y, and Z? Now, as a reviewer, I can tell you, first of all, it's unlikely that you're going to have the raw data. You're never going to be supplied the raw data. You're going to see all the figures. There's a lot of supplementary material, usually. You don't have the raw data to redo the statistics. You don't. And I can tell you that you also don't have the time. So if you really have a big paper to review, that's typically going to take 1 or 2 weeks, not continuously, obviously, but you have a lot of other work to do, right? So you're going to spend an hour here, 2 hours there. And then sometimes you're like, oh, wow, they use this new methodology. I have no idea what it is. You need to go and look it up. So it takes a lot of time just to assess whether the work has been done remotely correctly. Sometimes it goes really swiftly, you know exactly what they've done, and you're very quick. But sometimes you spend a lot of time. If on top of that, you would have to have the raw data and redo all the analysis, this has never been part of peer review. Of course, sometimes you have statisticians that are going to review the tests, right? And if something looks wrong, they plot the data and then they say this is the result of that statistical test and it looks really odd, then you're going to ask. You're going to say hang on, I don't believe that. Can you just send me the raw data? But otherwise, you take their value as you take their results as at face value. You don't question that. You never look at raw results. That's never been part of peer review. And so you have that system. I would really emphasize the power of the journals, and I think there could be a major change in the science system. The journals could be bypassed entirely if there would be, the government could put something in place. Governments could put something in place to put free online publication of your research, and then some kind of value instead of impact factor. It could be just rated by the scientific community. And the additional value of comments or things like that, you could do that. Someone could do that. Someone could see something that has been recently published and publish a comment or publish something that's being highly voted and oh yeah, that guy is really good at putting everything into context, right? But right now, it's based on journals with an enormous financial incentive. And to be very honest, they're also based on because sometimes they not just submitted work, sometimes they invite work. So they know people and they say, well, look, this seems to be bubbling up in the field. Can you write something about what you think there? And so they're going to choose what's being highlighted in their journals. So that to me is the definition of being politically active. That's politicized. Look a bit at the journals and see what kind of opinions they promote. And I am completely, listen, this is the first post on science, right? All of my previous posts and probably most of my future posts will all be on spirituality. I'm a deeply spiritual person. No one's bad. I just lived the science system for a long, long time now. And as I do in my spirituality or my perception of reality, I try to be all including. I'm trying to understand all of it. And if there's just one take-home message of my post here, is that the narrative so far of science has been really one-sided. And I'm just providing just a balance to that. And obviously the balance to that is obviously I don't need to spend hours here saying what you can read 1,000,000 times over in other sites, right? So I'm just providing the counter argument to that so that it's complete. I don't feel the need to say everything that already has been said. So I feel that journals are being political, and since the journals are influencing whether someone gets money or not, don't tell me that intrinsically the science system is not politicized. Of course it is. And then now you have comments based on the new executive order saying, well, we're going towards a nightmare here, state-directed research. You're allowed to do X, Y, and Z and not that. But that's already the case. That's already to some extent the case. Not completely, of course not. Nothing is black and white. But it's already to some extent. If you do something critical, good luck for being published in a high-impact journal. They're going to kick you out. They're not even going to send you to review. It's already like that. And so, playing devil's advocate, of course, every type of research is going to be great. Like Biden launched the cancer moonshot. Excellent. I would have put more emphasis on why do we have so much cancer instead of just boosting all these therapies that everyone has to pay, right? The health system is just collapsing because all these new therapies, especially the immune therapies, are just so expensive. So who's going to pay for all that? So I think in cancer things have to be a bit more balanced and actually understanding where it comes from. But now you have someone like RFK Jr., and he says, well, my emphasis is going to be on chronic diseases. What's wrong with that? Does anybody don't like to put in, is anything wrong with figuring out how chronic diseases emerge? It's just an emphasis. You really need to be completely biased to say that everything that's said in that executive order is somehow going to lead to a catastrophe. Of course, they are more critical about what has been done. But that's just like the playing both fields, right? It's always going to be the same case. Like the ones that do not like that, the same when they're gonna turn things around, they're gonna do the same. They're gonna do it in the other extreme. And again, just to give my particular perspective, I worked as an independent researcher in New Zealand for quite a while. I had to run after the money. I first was doing cancer immunotherapy. I had a infectious disease / transplantation background, went to do cancer immunotherapy, clinical trial in New Zealand. And then because I kind of ran after the money to retain gain my independence, I did nutritional immunology. So everything linked to nutrition. Was it my choice? No, it's not something I didn't raise my hand and say, I wanted to do nutrition and can I get please money for that? It's like, no, there's money for that. Do you want it or not? And I said, yes, I'm doing it. So, and that's what the government in New Zealand is doing all the time. They had those 10-year national science challenges. There were a dozen national science challenges where this is a political agenda, but it's science-based. It's like, look, we identified all these issues, and one political party is going to say, we're going to put the focus on global warming. The other political party is going to say, well, I'm going to put chronic disease, or I'm going to put X, Y, and Z. These are all good things because it's all supposed to be science done at the best level possible. But it's just going to be an emphasis on something, and that's everyone's like. I think most governments are doing that. New Zealand's doing that very blatantly and obviously. They're going to say, look, we want to do X, Y, and Z, and we want to be known as a government to have done that. And I mean, I guess, can you really criticize that? I don't know. I mean, it's how do you do science? You can. Either you give a little bit of money to everyone, or you say, well, hang on, this year we're going to do 50% of this, and then the rest we allocate to the rest. But like we put an emphasis on something. And so I had to run after the money, and so there were those national science challenges. They lasted 10 years, and then a new government came in, and then they slashed everything. And then now they went back and said and asked some consultants, well, what do you think we should look for? You know, like as everyone said, well, no, hang on. I mean, this is state initiated science. It can't be. No, it's just science in New Zealand, right? And so the question is really, does this executive order is it disproportionate? Does it say, and I can't read that. It's like people want to read something into that order and they read that, but I don't think it's disproportionate based on my experience. But like maybe people would go to New Zealand and think, oh my God, what the hell is happening here? And then they would be all over the place, you know, and they would try to tell everyone that wants to listen to them. Perhaps it's that, but based on my experience, they're just going to give priorities to something. So yeah, I hope I gave a bit context to all of this. Please don't think that science is all excellent and we need to follow the science. I mean, this statement makes me nauseous. And what you need to also know, when you go to conferences, for anything that's being said, you will find people that think exactly the opposite. Thinking that science is like, oh yeah, no, science tells us this. Like anything that anybody that says that is not a true, doesn't understand science whatsoever, or has a particular agenda, or wants people to believe something. In science, we agree to disagree. And I think what's really important in that order, that's exactly what's being said. You need to value opposite opinions, and you need to reframe your observations or your results in that different opinion. And I think that's a step in the right direction. And everyone that says, well, they want to read really bad things into it, they were obviously in favor of something where, hang on, there's one narrative here, and I like that narrative, and I think we should squash everyone who's not aligned with that narrative. But that's not how science works. Science is based on having different opinions and discussing it. And ideally, every single opinion will be valued. Of course, at some level you say like, okay, what you say is actually dumb, and like every once in a while you're like, oh my God, what are they saying? That makes no sense. And you need to check your own bias. I do that all the time, whether it's spirituality, whether it's in science. You need to check yourself. And there's a lot of people in science that are completely unchecked, not only by other people, but also by themselves. These are egomaniacs. They just want to be paid to do their pet projects, and they never change their opinion. And so I'm not sure. I don't have an opinion whether this executive order is going to really change everything. I feel sorry for all the eggs that are being broken right now in the US. The people, the really good scientists that have their funding pulled, that have to move overseas. This is absolutely terrible, absolutely terrible. And this overhead situation needs to be rethought as well. It makes no sense. I don't understand that. But does the science system need to be revised? 100%. 100%. And so I don't know. Well, let's see. You know, maybe I'm too dumb to see who's right and who's wrong here. We'll see what all this thing is going to lead to. I hope it's going to be constructive for the U.S. science system, because it's absolutely excellent. Has been excellent for a long, long time. Can it be made better? Yes, it can. So I'm really looking forward to see how the situation is going to evolve, and I really hope that something good is going to come out of it, because science deserves it. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope I could contribute a little bit, open a bit your eyes to what science actually is and what the science system is not being talked about enough. That it's a system with checks and balances, with people that have enormous incentives to make it continue as it is, and you need to address all of these aspects of the system. You can't just bash on the scientists. You need to address every single aspect of that. You need to address the funding bodies, and you also need to address the journals. Otherwise, you're not going to win. You're not going to change the system as a whole. So with that was a long one, but I really want to make sure that I get my point across. Yeah, I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to me.